Hey everybody. You must be here because you think watercolor painting is hard, or you want to get off on the right foot and not make any of these mistakes. Totally understand. I want to give you 6 reasons why you may be making watercolor painting harder than it needs to be. Also, I'm going to give you 10 reasons why watercolor painting is awesome. Let's talk watercolor. I'm Mark, and this is We Talk Art. While I own my art supply store, when I suggested someone try watercolor painting, I would regularly get, "I tried that, I can't do that," or "they are really difficult," or "I heard that they are hard." If I got the opportunity to question them on it, I often found it came down to a handful of mistakes they were making that was making watercolor really hard. Yes, to master watercolor, like any medium, it can be challenging, but watercolor is no more difficult than most other art mediums, and it has many advantages that make it a great medium to know and use. And I'm going to cover some of those toward the end of this video, so stay tuned. Let's start talking about what watercolor is. For starters, you may find it interesting that the use of watercolors go way back. No, probably before that. Some of the prehistoric cave paintings used something akin to watercolor. Something a bit more like modern watercolors were used in ancient Egypt around 3000 BCE and in China in 200 BCE. Yeah, that far back. Starting around the 12th century, medieval Europe used a form of watercolors more like modern watercolors in their illustrated manuscripts. Although the Renaissance painters didn't usually paint final works with watercolor, they did do a lot of sketches, studies, and illustrations in watercolor. It was not until the 18th century in Britain and the 19th century in the United States did watercolors really be recognized as a fine art. And today, contemporary artists like David Hockney and others produce at least some of their works in watercolor, helping to legitimize it in the modern art lexicon. Like all paintings, watercolors are a pigment suspended in a medium. For watercolor, the medium is most often one or both of gum arabic, which is the most common, and or honey, both of which are traditional, although there are some synthetic binders out there. Gum arabic comes from a variety of acacia trees that grow in Africa. Who knew, right? As the name implies, water is very important to watercolors and is integral to the process. The water part is why watercolors are both great and some find it challenging. I'll be talking more about the watercolor characteristics throughout this video. So, what are some of the reasons that many artists find watercolors difficult, and how do we overcome them? One of the most common issues is picking the wrong tools or products in the start. And this is where we will start. Reason number 1. The one thing that seasoned watercolor artists point to as the most important thing to get right when picking the items to do watercolor with is probably the one that most people wouldn't think of, and that's paper. Choosing the right surface for any art medium is actually really important, but is vital for watercolor paper. Trying to paint on any paper that is not watercolor paper, or at least paper designed for a water-based medium, will result in a very unsatisfactory experience. The paper must hold up to the water, staying wet and damp for extended periods of time. It also must control how fast and how deep the water with the pigment is allowed to penetrate into the paper. Most papers that are not designed for wet mediums, like sketch paper, drawing paper, or other dry medium papers, will allow the water to soak right through the paper, pulling the paint into the paper. The surface will dry rapidly, not allowing the paint to spread or move in the ways that it was meant to do. The end result will be an irregular coverage, the paint not doing all the cool things it should do, as we will talk about, and probably a dull and faded look that frankly will look like shit. Techniques that are important to watercolor, such as reactivating, blending, and lifting, will not work as expected, and some papers may start to curl, wrinkle, or just fall apart under the water load. A good watercolor paper will be designed for the water and the paint to mostly be held near the surface of the paper by using a sizing, which is a starch-based or animal-based product, to keep the water and the paint from soaking through and into the paper. The paper will also be sturdy enough to reduce the curling and can stand up to the wet brushwork on the surface of the paper that is necessary for watercolor. Although some mixed media papers will offer an okay experience with watercolor, and in some cases an artist may prefer that for special techniques such as the paper name implies, mixed media use. Watercolor paper usually is the best though. There are several characteristics of watercolor paper you should consider. First, many manufacturers of watercolor paper offer paper in different surface types. The most common are hot press, which is smooth, cold press, which has a moderate pattern texture to the paper, which we refer to as tooth, and then there's rough, and that has a really heavy tooth to it. The most common is cold press watercolor paper because the tooth offers some ability to hold on to the water and the paint, giving the artist a little bit more ability to control the paint on the paper. The tooth also interacts with the pigment in the paper to create a bit of a visual variation to the paint as it dries. The rough surface is not as common and is more often used by artists that are going for a special technique that the rough surface helps with. This might be an exaggerated texture to a dry brushstroke look, further restricting the flow of the paint, or a more visual texture to the end painting. Hot press paper, the smooth paper, some artists just like the smooth finish to paint on, while others feel like the paint doesn't lay down as evenly. Hot press is a great option for more detailed work and for mixed media applications involving things like pen and ink. The next characteristic is the weight of the paper. In the United States, weight of the paper is in pounds and refers to the weight of one ream of paper, usually 500 sheets, and the size that it was manufactured in. That's not necessarily the size you buy it in. Unfortunately, this can vary somewhat between manufacturers. In much of the rest of the world where they use the metric system, the paper is in grams per square meter GSM, which offers more consistency because of the size restriction. The most common weights of watercolor paper are 90 pound or 190 GSM, 140 pound or 300 GSM, and 300 pound or 640 GSM. You will find the variety of other weights, but they're not nearly as common. 90 pound or 190 GSM is not much thicker than a normal drawing paper or a standard mixed media paper. This is often an affordable option and may work for journals and sketching in watercolor, but it may not handle heavy water or other techniques. It will want to curl and warp easily. If you use this paper, you'll probably want to work in a block form or learn to stretch your watercolor paper. The 140 pound or 300 GSM is the most common weight. It'll handle a fair amount of water and paint and working. It will also feel fairly substantial and will give your art a higher perceived value, but it is mainly popular because it just works best for most artists. This would be close to a cardstock in thickness and still have a tendency to warp under heavy water use, so blocks or stretching might still be a good idea. The 300 pound or the 640 GSM is almost as thick as a cereal box material. It's really thick. It's quite thick and will not want to curl as much under the most demanding water usage or painting techniques. It will often require you to use more water when doing a wet-on-wet technique or washes. It is considerably more expensive than the lighter brands of paper, yet it is impressive, and if you're going to do final work for an important show or a client, this may be the paper you want to consider. The final important characteristic of watercolor paper is going to be what it is made of. The most affordable option is going to be watercolor paper made from wood pulp or cellulose fiber. This is a material used for most papers such as sketch, draw, or mixed media papers. The more expensive and, of course, better option is cotton paper. A few manufacturers such as Fabriano offer a blend with 25 or 50% cotton paper, which can save you some money. Yet, most watercolor artists will insist you should use 100% cotton watercolor paper for everything except sketches or studies. The 100% cotton watercolor paper just performs better in most regards to cellulose paper. Better water handling, less prone to curling, and is stronger and will stand up to more working. I believe the paint sits on it better, making it look better and perform any of the other functions such as blending, flowing, and such just better. So, if you can afford 100% cotton watercolor paper, it is the way to go. But as you are learning, you might start with a cellulose-based paper by a good manufacturer such as Strathmore, Canson, or Fabriano. Just know that the results are not going to be as good as the cotton option. In the US, Arches is 100% cotton watercolor paper that most watercolors like, at least in my experience. Although there are several other brands that do very well and might be cheaper or offer you a characteristic that you might like. These include Fabriano, Sanders Waterford, Hahnemuller, Legion Stonehenge Aqua, and a new Chinese manufacturer called Bohung. The cost-effective 100% cotton paper that I sometimes use is the Fluid 100, and the 100 is for 100% cotton watercolor paper. Watercolor paper can be purchased in sheets. The most common size is 22 inches by 30 inches, the size I was just trying to wrangle. This is 56 centimeters by 76 centimeters. Although some art supply stores will sell half sheets or quarter sheets, you can also find it in larger sizes and rolls, but usually you'll have less surface or weight options. Watercolor paper also comes in pads and blocks in a large variety of sizes. The pads are like any other pad, they're glued on one end. Blocks are like pads, but they're often glued on 2 or 4 sides. Like this Arches pad here is glued all the way around. Fluid glues just on the top and the bottom, and the sides are open. This allows you to get the paper wet, and as it dries, it will tend to stretch back out, being relatively flat. When it is dry, you'll need to cut it off the block with a knife or a bone folder. The trick is to find the corner or this side where the paper is not glued. In this case with the Arches it's there. With Fabriano papers it's usually one corner. You can also find art journals with both cellulose and 100% cotton watercolor papers. This is an Etcher Labs 100% cotton watercolor paper. This is Hahnemuller and another Etcher Labs. And this is an Indigo. This one's kind of cool. It has deckled edges to the paper. In summary, I would recommend choosing a cold press watercolor paper at 140 pounds. And if you can afford it at some point, try 100% cotton during your learning process. We're on to reason number 2. You're using the wrong brush. If you go into any art supply store and go to the brush aisle, it is easy to get overwhelmed. There is a lot of options, and I know you're just learning and you might just go in, grab one of those small inexpensive brush sets and start watercoloring painting with that. Understandable, yet wrong. Most of these inexpensive brush sets are designed for kids and acrylic paint, which is considered a heavy body paint. It takes a fairly stiff brush to move that heavy paint around, and most of them are made with simple nylon bristles, both of which don't do well with the near watercolor consistency of watercolor paint. What you need is a fairly soft brush that will pick up a lot of water and then release it in a predictable way onto your paper. So what is this magic brush, you ask? I would start your search by looking for a brush that says they are for watercolors. Now, some of those little packets do say that, but they're still just that cheap nylon material. I'd recommend going to the brush racks of the single brushes. This should be a brush rack that says watercolor on it somewhere. Also, watercolor brushes are typically a short handle brush. Long handle brushes are more made for oil or acrylic painters. This is because they are usually painting at an easel and standing farther back from their work. Watercolors usually hold their brushes a little bit more in the pencil style and are much closer to the paper. Yet, not all short-handled brushes are watercolor brushes, and you can find watercolor brushes in a long-handled version, just to confuse you. With that said, you will find in a good art supply store there's a lot of brushes for watercolors. Like the paper, there's a lot of options, but to start with, you're only going to need a few. There is a saying in watercolor circles, your first 3 brushes should be rounds. This round brush style that comes to a nice point is going to be the most used and versatile brush for watercolors. So, a small, medium, and large brush will be a good choice to start with. Artist brushes, including watercolor brushes, usually show their sizes with numbers, like 0 through 20 or something like that. First problem, not all the manufacturers go by the same numbering system, so there will be a little bit of variation to that too. But when you start, a size 4, a size 8, and a size 12 will be a good starting point for you to go by. The larger you're painting, the larger brushes you'll want. On the other hand, most people try brushes that are too small. Start bigger than you will think. There are a multitude of shapes of watercolor brushes out there, but once you get beyond the rounds, most of the rest of them are going to be specialty brushes that will probably not be used often. The exception might be a 3/4 inch or 1 inch flat, and these are good for wetting your paper, doing washes and things like that. Some people tend to like quills and mops. These will hold a ton of water. There are other shapes out there like daggers, and of course the flat, and then you get riggers, and you can get long pointers, and fans, and some specialty brushes. So there are a lot of brushes you can find out there. You just are going to find that you're not going to use these nearly as often as you're just going to use this set of 3 rounds. So my recommendation is, again, start with the 3 rounds, master these brushes, and then you'll start realizing why you might look at some of these other brushes. The second consideration is what the brush is made out of, the fibers that are used to make the bristles. This is the major place these brushes will be better than the cheaper sets we talked about earlier. In a good watercolor brush, there are a few varieties, but most commonly for watercolor, they fall into 2 categories. Brushes that are made from a sable hair or a synthetic imitation, and brushes that are made from a squirrel hair or a synthetic. These 2 types of brush fibers, bristles, perform differently, and each has its advantages. Sable, or synthetic equivalent, is the most popular and a good starting point in that it holds its shape well when wet and gives you a brush sense on the paper. You can actually feel the paper underneath the brush. It also has snap in that it will always go back to its original form and its shape, usually. It is the best for control and sharp edges and fine line work. A good sable brush will also hold a fair amount of water, and it is also easy to control the amount of water it will pick up. Squirrel, or a synthetic equivalent, will hold a lot of water or paint, but when it is wet, it doesn't necessarily hold its shape very well. It has little snap and will not always go back to its original form. This is an advantage and a disadvantage. When it is wet, you can actually shape the brush into different shapes for various techniques so that you can make different kinds of marks on your paper. And the soft nature of the brush will allow you to do glazes and various other techniques that require that soft bristle. And as I said, it holds a lot of water and paint, allowing you to paint very long strokes without having to reload the brush. The squirrel brush can be a little bit harder to control how much water is in the brush due to how much water that it can pick up. Although this thirsty nature also allows you to do things like lifting and removing excess water from the paint, from your painting. I would not start with a squirrel brush, but it may be your 4th brush. A large round squirrel brush can be a really nice brush. A few final thoughts on brushes. Yes, originally these brushes were made from the hairs of cute little animals, and still some of the higher end brushes are made from those natural animal hairs. Nowadays, many of the brushes you will find are going to be synthetics. This is because synthetics are cheaper. The synthetic fibers have gotten to be a lot better at imitating the natural hairs, and you don't have to harm the cute little animals to get your brushes. The argument about the quality difference is still an ongoing argument. Many people still feel like the natural hair brushes are better, yet I can say that many of the synthetics are very good. It is also possible that the synthetic brushes will last a little bit longer. You might also see brushes referred to as vegan. This means that no animals were hurt in the making of the brush. This pertains to the hairs and the glue, which appeals to many. I would recommend starting with the synthetic, mainly due to price. As I mentioned earlier, you will often want to be using a larger brush than you might guess. I'm a detail nut, and when I started in watercolor, I thought I'd be using all these small little brushes to make the detail that I have so loved. Yet the truth is that these brushes don't hold much paint. So you constantly have to keep reloading the brush, and this can give your strokes and marks a hesitant look. A good quality round with a nice tip will often outperform a tiny brush because it has a much bigger body that will hold much more paint and will allow you to paint with much longer strokes and make a very confident looking mark. The summary, I would recommend picking up 3 Sable synthetic rounds for watercolor from a good manufacturer. Good starting point again would be a size 4, size 8, and a size 12. Reason 3, color. It's funny, this is the third most important item on this list, and yet many people focus on the paint first and often spend their money here. Regardless, it's still something you will want to give some thought to because a bad choice here will still ruin your experience. There is a huge difference from a kid pan set to a high-end pro watercolor. As with all things, I'm not suggesting to start out with pro-level products, although you'll want to be at least choosing a good paint. Watercolors, like other art supplies, have gotten to be fairly popular, so I see a lot of paint coming from a bunch of companies that I have never heard of and are not really known for making paint. This doesn't mean that they're bad, just it's hard to know. So how do you choose and decide on a good paint? My recommendation is to choose from a company that is known for making good paint. In the United States, these companies include Daniel Smith. In my experience, this is the most popular. Winsor Newton, Holbein, Royal Talons, Golden, and M. Graham all make really good paints. I might have missed one or two, but you get the idea. There are some higher end companies that are making some specialty lines of paint or coming from foreign places. Mameri Blue makes a great paint. Michael Harding makes a spectacular paint, and Schmincke is just well known for their paint, although these paint lines might be a little overkill for a beginner. Several companies in this list sell a student grade paint, such as Winsor Newton's Cotman and Royal Talon's Van Gogh line. That might be a good starting point for a beginner, yet there are some advantages of starting with one of the watercolor favorites. First, the main thing that makes watercolor paint, or any paint, expensive is the pigment that they put in that makes the color. The best colors come from good pigments, and many of these pigments are sourced from all over the world, and some of them are kind of rare. These good pigments are desirable for a few reasons. They are usually good, strong, and beautiful colors. They perform well in watercolors. They are usually light fast and will hold their color for a very long time, and they will mix with other pigments in predictable ways. Red and blue make purple or violet, blue and yellow make a nice green, yellow and red make a nice orange. You get it. What you lose with cheaper paints. The cost savings has to come from someplace, and it usually comes from how the color is made. They do one or all of the following. They use a cheaper pigment. This might be an alternative pigment. It could be a synthetic pigment or a combination of other cheaper pigments that makes that color or about that color. They may add fillers or other things to make the paint look more colorful or dense, or they just add less pigment. As I have said before, good paint will go a lot farther than a cheap paint, meaning that you'll actually use less of it. This reduces the value equation of the cheaper paint. Also, it may be that the cheaper multi-pigment paints or synthetic pigments may not mix as well to make the colors that you want. If you often get brown when you're trying to mix different colors, it may be cheap paint. Cheaper paint may also not last as long before it fades or discolors. One easy way to know that the paint you are looking at uses good pigments is that not all the brand's tubes of colors are the same price. This is because cobalt for cobalt blue is more expensive than umber for making raw umber brown. So they charge more for the more expensive pigment. If all the colors are the same price, it is probably a student grade paint or a kid's paint, and they are probably doing something, like I said before, to control the price. The pro paints are usually sold in series, which are grouped by color that are the same price. Most brands have about 5 series or prices, but some have more and some have less. But be ready. Some watercolors can be shockingly expensive for those little tubes. But know that one tube of watercolors used well will go a long way. One other thing that you might be confronted with when you go to choose your paint is what format it comes in. They come in tubes, which is a semi-liquid form. You can get them in pans, which is a dry format, which is very common. Some manufacturers, such as Daniel Smith, they make sticks that come like this. This is basically dried pigment. It's very similar to what would be in a pan, but in a stick form. And then some companies will also sell watercolor pencils, but just be warned that these are really not true watercolors per se, although they can be a lot of fun. Most artists choose the option that is best for their needs. Tubes for studio and home use, and pans are better for like road trips. But you can use either in most situations. Tubes are often probably the better value. I think you usually get more pigment, paint for the price, although the initial investment to get a starting palette for a set of colors might be pretty high. It should be noted that you can put tube watercolors into a variety of palettes and pans and let them dry, and they work just like pans, so you can make your own pan and travel sets. Pans can be more convenient, but require a bit more work to load the brush, and most of the palettes for pan sets are much smaller, designed to be portable. This restricts the amount of mixing area you might have, and you might be challenged getting a big brush into the small little pans to get them loaded. Pen sets may be overall more affordable, but usually you'll get much less paint. But, as I implied previously, it might be cheaper to get started with a set of colors this way. The trick for starting with dry paint on a palette or in a pan set is to spray them with water for a few minutes before you're going to start using them to get them all juicy and ready to be used. By the way, a spray bottle is an essential tool for watercolors. Those are the reasons that involve tools and paint. The rest are more technique oriented. I only list what I think are the big sticking points, but there's a lot of great techniques for watercolor. We just need to get you on the right path here, and that's our goal. We are at reason number 4, control. Let watercolor be watercolor. I once took a ceramics class, not too successfully, but one day the teacher went on this rant about people trying to make these realistic sculptures of things like animals and such with clay. He thought this was a misuse of the medium and said that artists should let clay be clay. At the time, I did not realize what a profound statement this was until later in my art journey. The statement is as important for watercolor as it is for clay. Let watercolor be watercolor. There's a lot of reasons an artist may choose a medium to do their art in, but every art medium has things that it excels at and often things that it does not. Although watercolors can do a lot of amazing things, many that can't be done or duplicated with any other medium, there are some things that watercolors do not do well with. I will start by saying some artists love to push mediums into areas that they generally don't belong. That makes their work somewhat exceptional, and if they do it well, it might even be good. But as a beginner, to choose a medium like watercolor to do something that it doesn't do well may be kind of disappointing. For instance, photorealistic work is just not a watercolor strong point. Yes, some artists do that well, but it is hard. Watercolor is great for works that have some level of abstraction. This is what watercolors excel at. Many artists turn to watercolors to loosen up and get away from the tight detail that other mediums seem to demand. Watercolor paint, like its name implies, is based on water, and water does one thing really well. It flows. A common artist statement about watercolors is, it is not a watercolor artist's job to control watercolors. It is to set it free so it will do what it does best. Meaning, watercolor may not be the best medium for control freaks. The art of learning watercolors is learning how to make the right conditions for the paint to move, flow, mix, and make all the beautiful effects that watercolors can do. The best way to learn is to play and play and play some more. It is fun and you'll make beautiful things. There are 4 overall techniques with watercolor that may not be obvious to someone new to it. The first way is wet on dry, painting with a wet brush on dry paper, probably the way most people imagine it working. This is how you will have the most control. The paint will generally stay where you painted, and you can get sharp lines. But the watercolor will not do a lot of the cool things, the flowy things that it can do. Wet on wet. This is painting with a wet brush on wet paper. This is really where the fun starts with watercolors. The color will want to flow through the water on the paper. This will create some ethereal looking marks. It is great for backgrounds and underpaintings. The paint will stop where the water stops unless you have a lot of water or you want to tilt the paper or it's not flat. Dry on wet. This is a fairly dry brush with thick paint on wet paper. This can create some fun looks too, and will sometimes require you adding more water to the paint with that squirt bottle I told you about earlier. Dry on dry. This is a relatively dry brush onto dry paper. This is how you get those amazing dry brushstroke looks. Works best on cold press or rough paper. Yes, there is some elements of control that is necessary. Once you learn how the pigment moves through the water, you will learn ways to make it do more or less what you want it, expect it, and need it to do. How much water needs to be in the brush. This is a big one. How much paint is in the brush. When to put the paint on a wet surface, and when you need to wait for everything to dry. There is an element of patience that is necessary for watercolor paint. Relatively speaking, watercolors dry fast, and there's much less waiting than other mediums. I love what watercolors do, but it is not for everyone. I would really recommend doing some research. Look what different artists are doing with watercolors. Include some contemporary and some old masters in your exploration. Do you like the look of watercolors? Do they inspire you? Do they make you want to paint? Or do you keep finding yourself looking at oils and acrylics and gouache paintings that are more to your taste? There is nothing wrong with realizing watercolors are not for you. But, as I said earlier, watercolor is amazing and it does things you cannot do with any other medium. Reason number 5. Process. Transparent paints work different. I think there is a handful of things that contribute to the fact that many new artists in watercolors often don't get the contrast and vividness to their watercolors that they expect, even when they're using all the right stuff. Most other paints are opaque, meaning that the light bounces off the paint and the pigment in the paint to produce the color. The process of getting the color you want is to put the paint of the right color onto your surface. And you can keep putting more paint over it to cover up the old paint until you get the color that you want. Watercolors are different because they're transparent. Light travels through the paint and reflects off the paper and then travels back through the paint again. The two passes through the paint make the color. If you put one paint over another, the colors will be a combination of the colors of the two paints. I think this transparent nature of the paint causes some people some grief in trying to get the look that they want. It might not be obvious how to get deep, dark, and very saturated colors, even when you're using all the right materials, if you don't use the right techniques. It is hard to know how much water to put into the brush and into the paint, often causing artists to use too much water and not enough pigment, leading to light, weak, or unsaturated colors. The fact that watercolors are transparent means that you cannot layer colors the same way with other paints, requiring a strategy to painting that is not the same as other paints. This transparency also means that if you're going to paint traditionally, that you must use the white of the paper to get your whites or your highlights, and not use like an opaque white. Although some artists do use an opaque white, I just think that it's important not to overuse it. It tends to not look the same or a little bit wrong. The solution is honestly easier than it might seem, although it's not required, but it can be really helpful if you work your painting from the highlights to the shadows, applying your lighter colors first and then building up to the more deeper, darker, saturated colors at the final layers. This is often achieved by layering your colors. It is helpful to realize that you can layer a darker color over a lighter color, and the darker color will overpower that lighter color. The opposite is unfortunately not as true. If you put a lighter color on top of a darker color, the darker color is still going to overpower the lighter color, and you won't get a whole lot of effect to doing that. This working from highlights to darks will allow you to preserve your highlights, create the contrast you're looking for, and protect your saturated colors. This will become second nature fairly rapidly. The other technique to learn is how to get the paint to the right consistency. You adjust the consistency with water, and you do this in 4 ways. This water in the brush as you pick up your paint, water on your paper, water that you might spray in or add later, and then the water that you mix with the paint prior to picking it up. The last being the easiest in my opinion because it allows you to get the paint to the consistency that you're targeting before you pick it up. The other options are great, but they do require a little bit of practice. A common teaching tool for explaining the paint consistency is to think about the paint mixtures as butter through tea. First stage, butter. If you're using tube paints, the paint that comes out of the tube is almost a butter consistency. It will be very thick and usually opaque. You can use it this way, but you will often have to apply water later in the process after it's on the paper. If you allow it to dry this way, it will tend to blob up a little bit. The second stage is cream. This will be the stage with the minimal amount of water to get the paint to start to flow. It will have the consistency of heavy cream and still be pretty opaque depending on the color. This would be used in the last parts of your painting when you're applying your deepest, darkest, or most saturated colors. Milk. This is a balance of paint to water. It will have a consistency of milk and be semi-opaque. The paint will start to flow but offer some control. This is often good for middle values. Coffee. This is a point where the paint starts to flow freely and the water will start making the paint more transparent, allowing you to build up your lighter colors. Tea. This is the lightest stage. This will often be the consistency that you will want for your initial layers and washes. It flows very freely and is fully transparent. This will also be a good consistency for doing glazing of one color over another. This will also be used in your initial stages when you're applying your lightest colors and the areas that you might want to build up with more colors in later stages. To get this to work right, you want to mix your paints to the consistency that you're looking for from that scale of butter to tea, and then using only a damp brush with not much water in it, load the brush with the paint. Too much water will change the paint consistency, resulting in the lighter unsaturated colors that you're suffering from. Using this system should help you get the colors, saturation, contrast, and shadows that you might be lacking when you're using too much water. Keep in mind that a good watercolor paint will give you all the vibrancy, saturation, and contrast you'll find in other mediums. To make your painting look its best, you will want highlights that are the paper white with no or little paint on it, and then areas that are in the dark shadows that might be achieved with mixing colors or layering colors to get a really dense dark shadows. Reason 6, colors and palette. Another place where some thought needs to be given is in what colors are you going to use. Many of the manufacturers offer a lot of color options, an overwhelming number of colors. The trick is not to get pulled into the idea that you need to have all those colors. You really only need a handful of colors for your base palette. Okay, when I say handful of colors, I'm talking about 6 to 12 colors-ish. Yes, I and most artists will have more colors, and I will sometimes even use them, but too many colors can make it harder than easier. The 6 to 12-ish colors will become your base palette. The more you use these colors, the more they'll become familiar to you, and the better you'll become at using them and mixing them. If you look around the internet at all, you will find no lack of people telling you what colors you should have in your base palette. But the reality is that over time, you will build up a palette that lets you make the art that you want to make. And it will be your palette made up of colors that you find useful, and it will be from brands that work for you. Until you get to the point that you know what this is, you'll probably have to choose some popular starting point. This could just be buying a set of colors from a good paint company, or finding an artist that you like and figuring out what colors they're using for their base palette, or just going down and picking a range of pretty colors, which is probably the least recommended because you need to have certain colors to create and mix other colors. And that's what you get from a good selected palette. Part of my base palette is derived from a split primary palette that is recommended by many people. This is 6 colors based on a warm and cool version of yellow, red, and blue. You can either buy one of the mini sets sold by companies like Daniel Smith or look for your favorite brand and what colors they are putting into their split primary set and use that as a guide. Daniel Smith's Essential Watercolor set, which is their split primary set, contains Henze Yellow Light, which is the cool yellow, New Gamboge, which is the warm yellow, Quinacridone Rose, which is cool red, Pyrrole Scarlet, which is their warm red, Phthalo Blue Green shade, which is a cool blue, and French Ultramarine, which is a warm blue. This should give you an idea of what a starting point might look like. Although there are many other options, the goal should be that you can mix the colors that you need from these colors, and the colors described in the Daniel Smith set or many other varieties will allow you to mix a lot of different colors. I will often then fill out my physical paint palette beyond those 6 colors with a few more colors that I find helpful or I like. This will usually include a couple greens, browns, an orange, and sometimes Payne's Gray. Yes, I know a lot of artists don't like Payne's Gray, but I do like it. Why limit your base palette to around 12 colors? It's probably kind of obvious, and I kind of mentioned it, but a smaller set of colors will actually make you a better artist. You will learn these colors, and you will learn how to mix these colors, and you will learn all the special properties of these colors and all the cool things about these watercolors, because a lot of them have a lot of special properties and they do amazing things. After this video, you might want to check out this video talking about how limits can make you a better artist. Also, have a color wheel and learn how to use it. These will help you pick your colors, mix your colors, and show you color relationships. These can help you out a lot in improving your art. Colors I would not include in your base palette until you know why or how to use them. White. For the most part, watercolors will use the white of the paper for their white. You will lighten colors by applying them with a lot of water or with a lot less pigment, so the paper shows through. This is compounded by the fact that most watercolor whites are transparent, as with most watercolors, and will not usually work the way you probably expect it to work. With that said, white can be useful, but as I said, it takes some knowledge to use it, and you'll probably find other colors much more useful in your base palette. Another color would be black. You almost can't search watercolor on the internet without finding 5 artists that will tell you you shouldn't use black. I personally do use black at times, and I feel like the whole never use black is a bit overstated, especially considering that you will find black pigment in many of the paints that the anti-black paint artists often use. With that said, like white, I would recommend skipping it until you know how to use it or if you even need it. The main point is that if you mix blacks from the colors that you're using in your painting, which is pretty easy to do, you will get a much more complex color that will make your shadows and the overall painting look much more interesting. The flip side is that the anti-black push leads a lot of artists to not get enough contrast to their work. I would always choose a black and get that contrast opposed to not using it and not having any deep blacks in your painting. The trick here is to learn to mix a good deep black. It is not hard and you'll want to use it. Specialty colors. I'm not going to go so far as to say don't use specialty colors. I would just recommend building a craft with your standard colors and not use specialty colors too often. These colors will include metallics and granulating colors and a variety of vivid colors like opera pink, which is a beautiful color, or any of the fluorescents that you might find, or some of the more exotic kind of natural mineral paints might fall into this category. These colors can add interest and visual appeal to your painting as long as they are not overused. The first time you see them, it's like, ooh, that's a pretty color. The second time is, oh yeah, that color. And then the rest is kind of like, oh yeah, I've seen that before. You can really make these colors work. You just don't want to overuse them. The exception might be a good use of a specialty color in a series to bind it together. It can be done, it just takes some planning. You can buy them and use them when they really work, but I'd not recommend putting them in your base palette. There are my 6 reasons that are probably holding you back from working in a great medium of watercolor. Before I jump into the awesome part of watercolor, there is one other thing that I need to address. If you have not yet gone out shopping for watercolors and supplies, you'll need to prepare yourself. Good watercolor supplies, like most other art supplies, can be a bit pricey. Pro-level supplies can set you back a bit, and specialty brands can make you wonder if you'll have to take a second on your house. Some things to keep in mind. A tube of watercolors like this will go a long way. These quality colors go a long way as long as you use them wisely and correctly. You can keep them even after they dry. Don't throw away good paint. Also, a quality watercolor brush with the right care will last you a long time, maybe even a lifetime. Paper. Well, you have to use paper. You know, there's a cost of doing everything. Don't waste it, but don't scrimp on it. There is nothing that will prevent you from growing like not painting because you think your paper is too precious. If you have to use a cellular paper to play or sketch, use it. But also, like I said, try the 100% cotton. It's great. It's worth the price. One trap to all this is many people will say, I'm just going to buy the cheap stuff because I'm learning. Although this can work for some things, it really does not work well for watercolors. There is a line. Below that line is the cheap supplies, and these supplies will just not perform well, leading to a miserable experience and causing you to quit and waste whatever money you spent on the cheap supplies. I'm assuming that if you've gotten this far in this video, you want to learn watercolor paint. Therefore, you will need to purchase at least a good student grade quality in the 3 things that I talked about at the beginning. Paper, brush, paint. Don't scrimp too far. Unfortunately, there is too many brands and options out there for me to identify all of them, but here are some examples in the US that you might start looking at. Paper. Most 100% cotton watercolor papers will work. If you want a practice pad, make sure it is a watercolor paper, at least 90 pounds, preferably 140 pounds. If you want to step up your practice pad, try the Fabriano 50% cotton watercolor paper, or even the 25%. At some point, try the 100% cotton paper. It's the real deal. Brushes. I would recommend a starting point would be a synthetic sable watercolor brush by a company like Princeton, Winsor & Newton, Da Vinci, Silverbrush, or one that is recommended by your local art supply store. Paints. As I said, you can use a student grade paint like Winsor & Newton Cotman's or Royal Talon's Van Gogh series, but if you can afford it, you'll be well served by using one of the more affordable pro brands like M. Graham, Winsor & Newton Pro, Daniel Smith. There are quite a few brands in this category, and then there are some that are arguably better than these popular brands. But I would not start out with them until you know why you might move up to them. It should also be noted that all watercolor brands work together. They usually use the same binder or something that is compatible, so combining brands to make your starting palette is not a problem. If you're taking a class and you don't have your supplies yet, it is usually best advised that you use what the teacher recommends so that you can follow along and get similar results. Again, I know there is a cost to getting good supplies, but the alternative is that you're going to get something that will lead you to a bad experience and you'll probably not want to continue. Perhaps that is why you're watching this video. So, my overall advice is buy the best that you can comfortably afford. Comfortably is the important word there. Now that I've told you to spend your hard-earned money, I want to tell you why watercolor paints are awesome. Awesome reason number 1. They are unique. Because of the unique characteristics of watercolor, mainly the water part, they can do things that almost no other art supply can do. A large part of this is due to the fact that the watercolors flow, and they flow in water. Usually the more water, the more it flows, moves, mixes, even pushes. The paints will go where the water goes. You can use gravity, blow on it, encourage it with a brush, or completely set it free by putting on it on really wet paper. All watercolors move in water, but some move even more than others. Also, different paints have different characteristics. Some have larger pigment sizes and granulates. Some will push other paints away. Others will mix with other colors, and some will lift and others will stain. And I can't forget transparency. It will be the main challenge you will face as you begin, but once you master it, it'll be one of the strongest characteristics. Learning these effects and knowing how to make them happen is a big part of watercolor, and it is a ton of fun. Play, learn, do it. You'll love it. Awesome reason number 2, versatility. As you begin to learn and master watercolor, you will realize that this medium is very versatile. It can support a huge range of style and techniques that can create a wide range of looks, from full-on abstract to surprisingly realistic renderings, despite what I said earlier. This versatility allows for a lot of room to grow a unique style that can be all yours. Awesome reason number 3, immediacy. In all but the most moist climates, watercolors dry pretty fast, and some artists will use a blow dryer to accelerate that even more. This allows the artist to work out complex compositions with little need to wait for paint to dry, which is a necessity for other types of paint. This allows the artist to render out an image in a short amount of time while the creative vision is still fresh in their head. As a matter of fact, most aspects of watercolor are faster than other mediums, which brings us to point number 4. Awesome reason number 4, easy to set up, easy to clean up. This is actually one of my favorite aspects of watercolor, and it kind of brought me to watercolor because it really doesn't require many complex tools or materials. It's just paper, brush, and paint, and a bit of water, and you're ready to go. And takedown is just washing your brushes out, closing your palette, and dumping your cup of water. It's probably only beaten by drawing. What I also love is that if you have a dedicated space for it, you can sit down and be painting in minutes. And when you're tired and or done, there's only minutes of cleanup that is necessary and you can be done. Simple, easy, fast. Awesome reason number 5, they can be used for final works, sketches, and or play. Once you get over the initial apprehension about watercolors, you'll quickly find that they are actually just fun to play with. Get a watercolor journal and just start playing. Wet a page and just start splattering color on it. What does it do? Put a dab of paint on the page right out of the tube and then start spritzing it with water. Pick up a corner of the page, let it flow. Add another dab of a different color, spritz it. Mix the colors on the paper rather than in the palette. Try mixing it with other water-based mediums. The fun is pretty much endless. Because it is fast, easy, and portable, it makes for a great sketching medium. Instead of using graphite for your next sketching session, take a small watercolor palette out and a water brush. And since the start of the 19th century, artists have started using watercolors for final works. There really is no limit to how you can use watercolors. I am always excited to see watercolors in museums and galleries, and it is happening much more often. Awesome reason number 6. They are great for plein air, painting outside, and or travel. Since there are a lot of small watercolor palettes, such as these by Artist Toolkits, I make one that fits into an Altoids tin. Winsor Newton, Daniel Smith, and a bunch of manufacturers make small palettes. And the brushes, a normal watercolor brush isn't really that large in itself, but travel brushes by Da Vinci that fold up on themselves, and Princeton and Raphael and a bunch of other companies make these travel brushes. You can put together a real small package. All you need is a small art journal and a bag to put it in. These bags can be small bags like this, another art toolkits thing, or just a little carry bag. And you just need to add some water and you have everything you need to paint. And you can even save more room by picking up a water brush like this that holds the water in the handle, and you just press a little button to get the water into the brush part. The result is that watercolors make a fantastic medium to do painting outside, plein air painting, and or painting on the road. Awesome reason number 7, lots of options. Watercolor painting is popular, and as a result, there is a huge number of options for paints, colors, brushes, palettes, tools, surfaces, and miscellaneous support stuff for watercolors. And there's even other things for other mediums that you can use for watercolors. Another advantage of the popularity of watercolor is that there is a ton of educational information out there on the medium. There are books, lots of books, websites, YouTube videos, lots and lots of videos, teachers, classes, groups, you name it. You'll never run out of sources of inspirations, fancy tools, interesting supplies to try. Awesome reason number 8. They make a great medium for mixed media projects. Because watercolors are water-based and they're a very simple formula, they can be combined with a lot of other mediums such as graphite, color pencils, water-soluble, just about anything, gouache, acrylics, pen and inks, pastels, printmaking, and I'm sure many other things. Companies like Daniel Smith have watercolor grounds and gesso-like paints that you can put onto a huge number of surfaces that allow you to paint watercolors on those. Daniel Smith even claims that their watercolor ground works on glass. Imagine that. They even have a clear watercolor ground. This can expand the possibilities even further. Awesome reason number 9. They are a classic medium. I already talked about this in the beginning, but I thought it deserves to be talked about here. Watercolors have a history that goes way back. You, by painting in watercolors, are carrying on that tradition and that history. Awesome reason number 10. There is a huge watercolor community out there. Watercolor painting is very popular, as I have said, in the US. It's also popular in Asia, Europe, and, well, the whole world. This results in a huge community of watercolorists everywhere you go. There are a couple of national watercolor societies here in the United States, and many cities and even smaller towns have watercolor societies or groups that include watercolorists. There is even a conference at up to a national level. If you become a watercolorist, you'll have no problem finding your tribe. Being a part of the community will greatly improve your skills and open you up to a huge world of watercolors. Awesome reason number 11. Yes, this is a bonus reason. Watercolor painting is a very shareable art form. Because watercolors can easily be made in a reasonable size, you don't have to take too long painting them, and the total cost of the materials to make a painting is fairly low, it can make a very shareable art form. I'm a big fan of sharing art, and this is a form that is very shareable. Yes, it can take a little bit to get to the 0.2 watercolor, but the actual cost of each watercolors is fairly low. I hope I have convinced you to at least consider trying watercolors. My art journey took me the long way around to finally get to watercolors, so I do understand the apprehension to trying it, but I can speak from experience. This is a medium that has a great deal of value, even if it's not your primary art medium. It will also serve you well as a sketch medium that will allow you to work out your ideas, compositions, and rendering challenges in a fast, easy, accessible, and color medium. Keep in mind, I only gave you the absolute starting information here to get you going, but this should be a good start. As I said, there is a ton of information out there on watercolor. Because it is a versatile medium with tons of techniques, you'll find a lot of opportunities to grow as a watercolorist. If you have any questions, comments, or thoughts, leave them in the comments below. Believe it or not, this and your likes and subscribes helps this channel out a lot. If you want to see more We Talk Art, I will put 2 other videos up on the screen here and here that you can click on. Otherwise, go make some watercolor art.